I want to welcome you all to the Colby Symposium's book presentation this morning. This morning we're going to be hearing from Barrie Dunsmore. And like many of you, I think that we know that there was another era of newscasting in this country that goes back several decades when we received all of our television news from just 3 networks. And it was more or less the same. Everyone had his or her particular favorite. But we all appreciated anchors in those news programs who we trusted and were solid in their reporting, long-serving, types like Chet Huntley and David Brinkley and Tom Brokaw and John Chancellor and NBC, Peter Jennings, Harry K. Smith, excuse me, and Harry Reisner and Howard K. Smith with ABC, and Walter Cronkite with CBS. And we also respected greatly the correspondence with those programs, the likes of the brothers Marvin and Bernard Kalb, Sam Donaldson, and one of the best, Barrie Dunsmore. As Ted Koppel says in his foreword to Mr. Dunsmore's book, we gave America television viewers what we thought they needed to know, not necessarily what they would have selected for themselves. Now that era is largely gone. We have good news sources of news today, but they no longer provide a common starting point for our national dialogue. We're very fortunate to have Mr. Dunsmore here with us today from an era that many of us think was a golden era of newscasting. He has an illustrious and long background. I've provided his background for you to be read. I think you want to hear him rather than me. But let me just say that he covered foreign affairs for ABC News for 30 years, reporting from Washington and abroad on the policies of 7 U.S. presidents, from Lyndon Johnson to Bill Clinton. He traveled with them all overseas and was a regular on planes of their secretaries of state. From 1965 to 95, he reported from more than 100 countries on virtually every major international event, from wars to summits to diplomatic shuttles. As I said to him on a phone call, that as an international affairs junkie, I was very envious of the many people he has met and the many stories that he has covered and witnessed. After I, again, will let you read his bio, I would like to add that after his retirement in 1995, Mr. Dunsmore became a fellow at the Joan Shorenstein Center of Press, Politics, and Public Policy, the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. In addition to lecturing on the role of the news media in shaping public policy, Mr. Dunsmore conducted an extensive study of the potential consequences of live television coverage of war, something very interesting here. And The Next War Live was published by Harvard in 1996. Joseph Nye, Dean of Harvard Kennedy School, and a favorite of mine, as my students know, described Dunsmore's work as exactly the kind of balanced, thoughtful, and probing analysis of which the school can be proud. He has won other awards, but let me just conclude with the comments of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger of his newest book that some of you have copies of, and he'll be discussing this morning. This compilation of essays dating from the weeks when he accompanied me on the Mideast shuttles in the early 1970s to his commentaries on the Arab Spring will mark Dunsmore firmly as one of the significant journalists of our era. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Barrie Dunsmore, and I want to thank him for the service that he's rendered to our country in sound news reporting, and he still contributes to Vermont, at least, in his commentaries in the local newspapers and VPR. Thank you, Barrie, for coming.
Thank you very much, Professor Thalman, and thank you all for being here this morning. Now that I'm a retiree, I don't usually get up this early. This is an opportunity, or is presented as an opportunity, for me to talk about my book. But my book is pretty hard to talk about because it's about almost everything. It's a compilation of columns, commentaries, book reviews, speeches, and other such things all of which I have written in my retirement years, and of which I'm quite proud. But in making a speech about my book, it's kind of difficult, so I'm focusing today on the section, which is actually a subsection of the book, which is on the news media, about which I know a little bit. When I retired, one of the things that I absolutely promised myself and anyone else who would listen is that I would not fall victim to that horrible affliction that infects so many people of my age. It's diagnosed as old fart-itis, and that's the belief that everything that happened in my time was wonderful and everything that's happening now is no good. But I have to be honest, sometimes it's hard sometimes it's hard to fulfill that promise to myself. As I look at the media landscape today, there are certainly things that are troublesome, at least that I find troublesome. And I'm going to talk today about the golden age of network television news and of the news media. Those of you who are experts in the subject, and I know that when I'm speaking here for the next few days, there are always more experts listening than I am on most of these subjects. But golden ages, whether they be of ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy or Broadway musicals, are largely a function and a creation of a unique set of circumstances. And those golden ages end when those special circumstances are fundamentally changed. So before I talk, however, about the demise of the golden age of television, as one person lucky enough to have been part of that era, I'd like to talk a little bit about it. The golden age of network television news runs, roughly speaking, from the middle of the 1950s to the middle of the 80s. And in those days, as the professor pointed out, there were basically three television networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they were the windows on the world for the great majority of Americans. Each night, more than 50 million people would be watching the evening news. And just to give you a basis for comparison, nowadays there are fewer than 20 million people who watch the evening news, and I have to say that virtually all of them are on Social Security. The young people don't watch the evening news. The newscasts evolved into a kind of town meeting therapy session, which people could use to ponder the momentous events of the world, of their nation, and of their neighborhood. And those were indeed momentous times for all of us. The Cold War was at its height, and in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, it seemed a very real possibility that we could have nuclear war. By 1965, the Vietnam War was raging, and by 1968, anti-war protests were everywhere in the country. Also in the 1960s, a president, his brother, and the country's most prominent black leader were assassinated, two of them in the same year, 1968. Now, beneath this seething surface that we had, there were several ongoing and interlocking social revolutions over race, feminism, the new technologies, and sexual freedom. At such a moment, the newly found power of television could have become an instrument for extremism and division, but it did not. More by accident, perhaps, than design, the news broadcasts of that era were voices of moderation amid the chaos. They reflected middle-class values and essentially centrist politics, mainly because those who produced them were middle-class and moderate, sometimes a bit to the left, sometimes a little to the right, but never very far from the center. The assassination of President John Kennedy was a watershed for television news. whatever warts have since been discovered on the persona of John